Welcome to Impostrix Podcast, where we affirm the lived experiences of professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome and racial toxicity at work. Here, we will get very open about all that it means to be a professional of color. We'll talk about race and racism, trauma and healing, conflict and resolution, and liberation and authenticity. The tools that you learn here will help you confidently address racial toxicity at work, put that imposter syndrome to the side, stand in your power, and resist racial gaslighting. I'm your host, Whitney Knox-Lee, a Black mother to Black boy children, a civil rights attorney living in the South, and an anti-racism educator and trainer. Here we go. Welcome to Impostrix Podcast. My name is Whitney Lee, and this is episode 0. I'm so excited. This is the first episode. This is the episode that you want to listen to if it's now episode 20 that you're coming in on, and you want to know who Whitney Lee is, and you want to know why I'm doing this, and you want to know why it's called Impostrix Podcast. This is the episode that you want to listen to. So thank you so much for finding me. Thank you so much for your support. Please don't forget to subscribe either on your audio podcast platform or on YouTube. I will be releasing episodes every week. And this podcast is all about affirming professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome and racial toxicity in the workplace. So first, who am I? I am a wife, I'm a mother to 2 young, rambunctious sons who are still in the cute phase. I hope they stay in the cute phase for as long as possible because, as you all know, pretty soon these Black boys are going to enter in the I'm a threat phase. And I got a lot of anxiety about that. So we'll talk about that later. But I'm also a civil rights attorney. And I'm an anti-racism and cultural humility trainer and facilitator. So in that role, I'm going into your workplaces and talking to you all about what anti-racism means and what your workplace can do to create a more inclusive environment, a more psychologically safe environment, a more diverse environment, and a more equitable environment. So as I said, this podcast is all about supporting folks who look like me. Me, this podcast is for me. And I have a feeling that it's also for you. Because if you're a professional of color and you have experienced imposter syndrome, feeling as though you don't belong, that you're intellectually fake or a fraud, that you've somehow tricked everybody around you into hiring you and doing your job, and that at some point down the line, maybe even today, this afternoon, you're going to be found out and fired. That's imposter syndrome. And if you've experienced that, look, this place is for you. If you've experienced imposter treatment, which is this idea of the folks that you are working around or working for or working with, or your clients, feel as though you don't belong in the space, whether that's because of your race or your gender or your cultural background or your ethnicity or your gender identity and expression or your sexual orientation. The things, they feel as though you don't belong and they're treating you as though you don't belong. That's imposter treatment. This place is for you. And then if you're a professional of color and you're experiencing racial toxicity in your workplace. So if you dread going to work because the policies and the practices in your workplace are actively working against you to prevent you from succeeding, whether that means you have policies that say you need to dress a certain way, but you're not paid enough to be able to afford to dress that way. Or whether it's policies that say you can't wear your hair a certain way, or you can't wear your makeup a certain way, or you can't dress a certain way. You belong here. If you are working with folks who are making comments that you feel are problematic, that are offensive to you, and these comments are about your race or someone else's race, or you notice that people who are ethnic global majorities are being treated differently by white folks or by other people of color, you belong here. And if you're somebody that's dealing with these aggressions, whether they're microaggressions, whether they're macroaggressions, whether it's bias and discrimination, whether you can put your finger on it or not, you belong here. Because we're going to talk about what it is that you're feeling. We're going to talk about race and racism and racial capitalism and white dominant culture, white supremacist norms. We're going to talk about conflict and how we can address these conflicts that come up in mixed race spaces. And let me just say, this doesn't have to be bad. It may be difficult. It may be uncomfortable. But I believe that we can work together with each other as a community of folks of color, but also in mixed race groups to make our work environments safer for folks of color, more equitable for folks of color, and a place where people of color can succeed, whatever that means to them. So how are we going to do this? I am so excited to bring you many guests who are going to share their personal experiences with you of dealing with imposter syndrome or dealing with racial toxicity, what they've done, how they've identified it, how they've addressed it or not addressed it, and what that's been like. We're going to talk to psychologists and scientists and healers and therapists. We're going to talk to all sorts of people about the various ways that racial trauma affects us and what we can do about it to heal. We're going to talk finances because look, y'all, we need to get our shit right. And we're going to talk about building wealth, not just having income, but building wealth. We are going to talk about how do we get through today when today feels so tough. We're going to be the community that maybe you feel like you need, that you're missing. If you have a sister circle like I do, awesome. Consider me your second sister circle, myself and the rest of the listeners, because we're going to be right there with you. So in addition to having guests, I'm going to do bi-weekly asked and answered sessions. These are going to be times where you guys can submit questions about what you're experiencing and how can it be handled. And I'm going to give you my response. So as you're listening to this podcast and you have questions about something that you've been experiencing, please submit those to me. You can email them to me at impostrixpodcast@gmail.com. You can DM me on Instagram at Impostrix Podcast. And I'll do my best to respond to you either in the podcast or directly via email or through a message, because this is something that we're working through together. As I said at the beginning, like this podcast is for me. I need to know this information. I want to hear from y'all about what you're experiencing and how you've handled it. And I'm going to share with you my experiences and the experiences of our guests. So we're going to have themes during this season. This season will go for a few months, and the themes will be personal stories and tools for overcoming imposter syndrome, racial toxicity and how we can identify and address it, historical context and scientific data behind race, racial capitalism, and racial trauma, and then self-advocacy and conflict resolution. So join us as we talk about each of these topics one by one. We're going to spend a month on each of those topics. And I think it'll be really interesting. I've learned a lot as I've been talking to my guests. So if you think you want to join along, and I hope you do, please subscribe. That way you'll get the episodes as they're released. And, you can subscribe on YouTube. You can follow me on social media, on Instagram, again, at Impostrix Podcast. I'm on TikTok. There's a website, www.impostrixpodcast.com. And importantly, I really want to build a community. I think that we can heal from racial trauma, that we can really, through healing, become rooted in our core values individually and as community, that we can become rooted in our power and kind of unearth the power that may have been hidden from us because of the things that we deal with. I'm hoping that as we're having these conversations and folks are really starting to think about where they belong, how they belong, that they belong, that you are the shit. As folks start to think about this and really feel it and feel validated, that we're also starting to figure out what our values are so that when we are in positions of power where we are leading people, whether that's in the workplace, in our families, our communities, that we're doing so with our values and with our power in mind and not the values of somebody else, of another culture that does not serve us. That's the point, is creating more equitable and inclusive and strong communities of color with us at the lead. And there are a couple of questions that I want to answer right off the bat. The first is, why the name Impostrix Podcast? I knew that I wanted to create a podcast where we talked about the intersectionality of imposter syndrome and race. But I did not want the podcast to have imposter in the name because I don't want to claim it as something that is negative. Instead, I want to leave people feeling emboldened and powerful and seen. And so when I was thinking about naming the podcast, the first thing that I thought of when I thought of power and women, and this is a testament to, the gendered nature of our country, but the first thing that I thought of was a dominatrix. And whatever your thoughts are on being a dominatrix, I thought that combining the word imposter and dominatrix would be cool. So I named the podcast Impostrix Podcast, which is a combination of imposter and dominatrix. And then later, I found out that impostrix is actually the female conjugate of impostor. So that's why the show is named what it's named. It's because I want to talk about these things, but I want us to feel powerful. I want us to feel good. And, I hope that when you're listening to this podcast, that is what you leave feeling. And the other thing that I want to address is my tagline, which is be validated. When I say be validated, what I mean is that I want you to, when you listen to this podcast, to feel as though you belong and that I believe in you, that this community believes in you. I want you to feel engaged because this isn't teaching. I don't feel like I'm teaching. In fact, I feel like I'm learning more than anything. But I want to engage with my listeners, with the audience, about what it is that they're experiencing, because I feel like that's how we can build community, is by relating to each other in our shared experiences. And then the affirmations and the affirming that I want to do as we have these conversations is that I want every listener to leave these conversations feeling valued, feeling affirmed, feeling limitless, feeling intuitive, and that you are free to listen to your intuition and to block out the naysayers, to block out the rules. If the rules don't fit within your value system, or if they don't feel right to you, I want to encourage people to listen to their gut, to listen to their inherent power. I want people to know that they're deserving of whatever it is that they're striving for, that they've attained and achieved. You're deserving of that. I want you to feel activated. So when you leave after listening to this show, if you're on your way to work, or if you're on a lunch break, or if it's just the weekend, I want you to leave feeling activated, feeling as though you have a plan or there's a spark that's been lit in you and that you're going to follow up on that spark. I want you to feel treasured because you are. I want you to feel emboldened. And then lastly, I want you to know that you're divine. So each of those words has a meaning within the spelling of be validated. So when I end my episodes and I say be validated, that's what I mean. I want you to feel like you belong and you're believed. I want you to feel engaged, valued, affirmed, limitless, intuitive, deserving, activated, treasured, emboldened, and divine. And then one final word for listeners who are not people of color, for white people or for white passing people. I want you to know that in this space, we are going to center Black and brown voices and experiences. This is a space for you to sit back and listen and learn and maybe get some of those questions answered that you don't know how to ask, but you have the question. I want this to be a space for you to be able to reflect on what your experiences have been and how you can show up in solidarity with folks of color in your workplace, how you can show up as more than just an ally, but an active anti-racist, and how you can start to center, if you're not already, how you can start to center the voices and the experiences and the knowledge and the expertise of your Black and brown colleagues and friends and family members. Because that's important. It's important for us to know as we continue to operate and move within this multiracial space and multicultural space. And it's important, I think, for all of us to have a better understanding of what each other are experiencing. So I hope that if you're white or white passing, that you do stay and that you do listen and that you value these voices as much as I do. So share with your friends, with your families, with your coworkers, with your white coworkers and your coworkers of color. Because although this podcast centers people of color and you will only hear voices of people of color on this podcast is for everybody because it takes all of us. It takes all of us to create what we want to see. So share with your coworkers, share with your friends, share on your Facebook page. I would love to have you join us, and I would love to have your community be my community. I look forward to talking to y'all next week. And, this is my first time doing this thing. I don't know anything about editing audio. I don't know anything about editing video. So if you have feedback, if you got tips for me, please let me know. Please let me know how I'm doing so that I can improve. I want this to be accessible. I want the language that I'm using to be accessible for folks so that we can engage in dialogue and so that you can engage in dialogue with those that you're interacting with. All right, y'all. Be validated. Until next time. Shoot, I always forget. So if you're liking what you hear and you learn something new, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. Follow Impostrix Podcast on Instagram at Impostrix Podcast. You can check out the website at impostrixpodcast.com or send me an email at, you guessed it, impostrixpodcast@gmail.com. We release new episodes every week, and I would love your feedback. Let me know what you think. And don't forget, be validated. Until next time.